listeners of the Mad Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, joined today by Mike Damante. Mike, how you doing, man?
Doing great, man. Thank you so much for having me on again. It's been a while since we've done one of these. I know, we talk, via social media as well, with each other, but it's kind of cool to, do your show again because it's one of the best ones out there for sure.
Thanks, man. Dude, it is so much fun to have you on. I'm really excited to have you on today. So, listeners, the reason that we're talking to Mike today is that he has just published a book, Punk Rock and UFOs, Stranger Than Fiction. It's available via, Amazon and Kindle, available paperback. It is well worth the money, well worth the time to read it. It's so good. A nice continuation of your book, True Believers. And really just kind of, you now have like a series of these going, man.
Yeah, it's almost like I may have mentioned in the book, it's almost like a completion of a trilogy.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I was thinking like all great trilogies, you have to end on a strong point. So that was the goal for this book, is to kind of thematically tie up the other ones and also stand on its own too, just to kind of, if this is the last book I ever read about UFOs, I'd be happy with. That was my mentality going in.
Yeah, so this book in particular, so for listeners that don't know, I guess, why don't you give them a little bit of background on you? I mean, we've had you on the show before, so hopefully people know who you are already. But a little bit of background on kind of you, why you come to this subject in the first place, what you're thinking here on this stuff is.
Absolutely. So once again, Chris, thanks for having me on again. So my background outside of UFOs and weird stuff, I used to work for the Houston Chronicle, Hearst Media, for about 7 years on the copy desk. Also did some writing. I also worked on their website. I did some reporting. I did a little bit of everything there. And now I teach full time. But as a kid, I was really into, comic books and action figures and science fiction and horror, scary movies. And when I first started reading more non-fictional text, one of the first things I was drawn to, Time Life did the series, and each month it was a new one. It was like Mysterious Places, UFO Phenomenon. So as soon as I started reading those, I really got hooked because it was, I was able to sink my teeth into those because it was very much like the fictional things I was reading too, but there was some truth in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. So that piqued my interest at a young age. And then I would say probably like maybe 6 or 7 years ago is when I started to actively investigate this stuff myself. I was never really, I was always into it. I never stopped being into it, but there comes a point where you're not just a bystander anymore, you're a contributor. And I wrote my first book, and then and then eventually, punkrockandufos.com started just to be a continuation of that research. And then the second book came out, and then as I continued my research on the website, I decided to do a third book to really just wrap it all up. And so that's where we're at now. Punk Rock and UFOs, Stranger Than Fiction.
Sweet. Yeah. So one of the interesting things, in my mind at least, that happens in the book, or one of the interesting things that you kind of go over, is the idea that, so we hear a lot about this idea that, all of this might be connected in some way, right? All of this is one phenomena, right? And kind of, I think, famously, the big proponent of that right now is probably Hellier. That's kind of the way that people today are kind of, taking it in and seeing it for the first time. It's an idea that's been around for a while. But I really like, what I like about your book is the idea. So your book doesn't give any definitive answers. Your book is mostly asking questions and then providing some interesting context and thoughts around those. And it's kind of refreshing in this field where people are writing books and they're saying things like, I was on this base and this is what UFOs are, right? For someone to be like, well, I don't know what they are necessarily, but I think this is all really interesting. I think that this idea or this line of thought is interesting. It almost felt to me very much so like kind of a primer on, we've talked a lot about on the show about this idea that, we want to see this subject taught or at least thought of more academically, because we think there's something interesting here. These stories are worth telling. They're worth hearing, regardless of the veracity of the underlying claims. And what your book really, I think, is interestingly does is it's kind of like it's almost a primer on one school of ufological thought, I guess is what I would say. Not really just UFOs, but one realm, I guess, of kind of esoteric or maybe paranormal thought, which is the idea, which is really a metaphysical kind of school of thought here, right? That not only are these subjects connected in some way, potentially, but that there appear to be links to our subconscious, to our stories, our myths that we tell ourselves and that we've told since we began telling stories. And that maybe there's something deeper to those kind of motifs that keep appearing. And the coolest way you do that is by talking about Batman and Superman, right? That's like the easily the coolest way you do it. Although, yeah, as I was reading it though, I seriously, so listeners, as I'm reading this book, I texted Mike and I was like, where are the Sandman references, bro? Like, what's going on? Why is there no Sandman in here? Where's the books of magic? So tell us a little bit about that link, I guess, or what do you think is there? What do you think is interesting about that?
So you actually brought up quite a few points before leading into the question. One of the things that you were talking about is, I ask a lot of questions and I bring up a lot of points. And, as a journalist or just as a researcher in this case, that's all we really have is questions, because with this field, it's so hard to find definitive answers. But if you're asking the right questions and you're getting people to open up their minds and their way of their thought processes, that's how you make progress. And you made a really good point earlier about about this potentially being studied academically one day. And how this book could be like a primer for that. And that's actually a really cool thing to say, because I wrote it where you could give this book to a college professor who's maybe a humanities professor, or somebody who teaches, I don't know, maybe religious studies or a class like a mythology class. And then you can also give it to some kid in high school who watches Stranger Things and Star Wars, right? Or you give it to someone who's into ufology or someone, and they could all kind of read it, and it's kind of all on the same level. Where they could hopefully find a commonality. And that is the goal here, is for people to find a commonality with the paranormal and say, hey, you know what, this stuff isn't really so weird. There's something there. And to try to normalize this idea that, honestly, if you look back from the beginning of time, all these weird occurrences have always been happening. And only now we consider them paranormal. Back then, they weren't considered that extraordinary. So I think you bring up a really good point about academically, this is something where, and maybe some instruction may be going. And we were talking earlier off the air, and we were saying how come, you made the point that how come when somebody with a PhD says crazy shit, it's okay, but if it's, just someone on a subway talking about a subject, they're crazy. And I think that was a great point to make, because, there are colleges, big universities that have, large humanities programs, when they really talk about this stuff. Professor Jeffrey Kripal, somebody I quote in the book, he's a friend of mine. He's doing that in Rice University right now. I went to his class one day to speak to the students, and he has great kids. These are, and then, like I said, Rice is a very prestigious university. So for them to be accepting about these types of classes, I think that speaks volumes in terms of academic acceptance to some of the more, supernatural and paranormal topics.
Yeah, when it is, I think, interesting. So one thing you really I think, again, just to reiterate, I think you do really well in the book is the idea of it is written and presented in a way, like you said, where you can give it to a kid who's interested in this stuff and they can understand it. But if you're looking at this with a more rigorous sort of, I guess, kind of, I don't know, coming at this from the perspective of, like you said, a religious studies or philosophy or humanities, you can still, there's a lot of meat to chew on. There's a lot of stuff there. And I think there is something to the idea of the breakdown, where the ideas and the concepts you mentioned in the book, things like there being kind of a common storyline that, repeats, right, in human cultures. And, well, why does it repeat, right? In the book, you mention the nightmare and the old hag and, these other kind of folklore things that represent or try to explain a scary hallucinatory or maybe not hallucinatory experience people have when they're asleep, or maybe not asleep, right? This thing crushing your chest and meeting you in the night and taking you out of bed. That is something that was discussed academically in philosophy for generations, right? For years and years and years. And these ideas of, can your mind be tricked? What is it to cognate? What is it to think? What is it, you know, this idea of there being two realities, one reality that is physical that we see in front of us, but also one where our brains and our minds create objects and move things and do things themselves, kind of our inner thoughts. All of that is a very, very long academic tradition, longer than science has. So I guess I wonder, in your perspective of this, how do you introduce this stuff, this kind of high concept, difficult subject matter, to the same crowd that gets a lot of information from something like, say, Ancient Aliens? Like, how do you put them together? How do you bridge that gap?
See, I don't think it's that hard with that crowd because they already accept a lot of weird stuff to begin with.
Sure. Well, yeah, right. Well, yeah, sure. Oh, so yeah, I guess actually, you know what? Let me rephrase it. Right? How do you reconnect the thread?
Okay.
Because yeah, those people that are watching Ancient Aliens, those folks that are already into this stuff, they're like, right on, man. I'm with you, right? So there's nothing to connect there. I think you're correct. I think that's the part that's interesting for me is connecting that academic thread that we kind of lost with the advent of material science and materialism, as and kind of philosophy kind of saying, well, metaphysics is too ridiculous and we're throwing it away, and now we're all Marxist and we all believe in determinism, right? How do you reconnect that thread to academic philosophy or religious studies or whatever? I think in your book you talked a lot of those folks, but I think it's gonna be hard.
Well, I mean, you said it earlier, like a lot of these themes are discussed in philosophy already. But I think once you start bringing these cases, even like, so what I want to do in the book is like, I bring up some current event stuff, like a lot of like the Tic Tac and a lot of those things as well, because there's something that's, it's big and it's current. So if someone's able to kind of see that, oh, hey, I saw that on the news, maybe they read a few articles about UFOs, then they start going further down that rabbit hole in the pipeline. They say, wow, you know what, this has been happening for centuries and it's been seen differently culturally and culturally. I think the goal is for that individual to make those connections himself. And I think, in some of the academic classes, students are already doing so. I think it's great when professors, like Professor Kreipel, who brings up UFOs and abductions and all these things to his classes, and journalists like Leslie Kane, who goes to speak to his classes, and she's also writing books on near-death experiences. And so these are people like kind of putting their professional reputations out there to kind of talk about these subjects that were potentially viewed a certain way years ago. And I think it's fascinating because so every year I teach. So we do one day of like during the professional development where we'll teach each other. And every year I do like a UFO or a paranormal seminar, and a bunch of teachers come in and you never know what to expect. And I'm always shocked by how many of them are so open-minded, even to some of the more out there stuff. Like, I'll bring up I throw them with everything crazy just to kind of see their reaction. I'll throw in Skinwalker Ranch, goblins, I mean, you name it. And, it's always fascinating. Like there's one teacher who I would never expect in a million years would say something to this matter, but like, she was like, yeah, because she's like religious. She's very like by the book. And she's like, yeah, I used to live on a farm growing up in kind of over by Kentucky, and I used to see these little things in the night. And I'm like, and then she wouldn't tell anyone. And finally, she brought it up, and her brothers and cousins were like, oh, I saw that too. And it's like, I would never in a million years expect her to like believe or have a sighting like that. So it's like these things are more common than you think. So I think we're already kind of working into that gray area where we're able to make these connections easier nowadays. Because I think one of the points I try to make in the book is, through pop culture, a lot of these things are already out there. So people are familiar with, experimentation and telekinesis and all these things that we've seen in comic books and movies. They're already familiar with these themes. And so if you present to them, hey, this could be real, I don't think it's that much of like a blow to them.
Yeah, that's kind of, I guess, the underlying, for me at least reading it, and maybe I'm wrong, And I always think it's really funny. Because you're a teacher now, so you probably ask your students this question actually, where you ask them or they read a book and then you're like, well, what is it that you think the author meant by this book, right? Now is like a podcaster. Yeah, now as a podcaster getting to talk to the authors, I'm always like, well, this is what I think your book's about, right? And they're just like, no, you're wrong, incorrect, sir. I wonder what Emily Bronte would have thought of my reading of her works. Probably not have been happy, but so for me at least, it seemed like the underlying thesis of the book was this sense or this idea that a lot of these ideas appear to be, like you just said, a lot of these ideas appear to be out there until you think about all of the all of the stories that it, and even again, some of them are myths, some of them are legends, some of them are religious, some of them are whatever. But a lot of those stories aren't that hard to stomach. They're already been told to us. We already think of them as, you know, not necessarily plausible, but at least something we've been exposed to. So how far is that leap between, I guess for lack of a better term, like a world with and without magic, right? Or a world with and without aliens, or a world with and without God or whatever, right? I think it's a really interesting point you bring up in the book. And I don't know if that was your underlying thesis or not, but I'm telling you as a person who read your book that it is. So, you have to agree with me now because it's my show, so I don't care. Well, it's like, for you, what was your underlying thesis, I guess? What was your...
Yes, so the goal of the book, and I think I use this line somewhere in there, it's to normalize the paranormal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like you said, a lot of these things aren't too far-fetched because they've been showing up in mythology, legends, and religious texts, even in our historical texts as well. And, at one point, science fiction was science, and
Mm-hmm.
vice versa. They feed off each other. The things that you see in some sci-fi movies eventually become doable.
Mm-hmm.
Not everything, of course, but it's like, so they all really kind of lend hand in hand into the, not the sense where they're blurred, but they've influenced each other, throughout time. So it's not like it's this, the shock that, fiction and nonfiction somehow connect somewhere in the middle of time. So yeah, the goal of the book is just kind of normalize these paranormal and these weirder topics and occurrences, because if you do that through, if I can make the connections to a comic book someone read, or Stranger Things, or Star Wars, or whatever, then I get that person thinking about it, then they can make those connections on their own. And this is something, we're talking about, you said about Sandman, and I didn't read much Sandman growing up. I maybe read one comic, but I asked myself a similar question. I was rewatching all the old Marvel movies. I was like, oh, you know what? I could have put that in there. Like, there's a bunch of stuff I could have put in there, right? But I said, well, the point of the book is I didn't want to put every single mythological and pop culture connection to paranormal. I wanted to I did select versions of it, ones that I'm well versed on, and ones I can make connections with, because I want the reader to kind of do that on their own. I want someone maybe read my book and then they watch Stranger Things and they say, oh, wait a minute, that Montauk was a real place. And then they research it, and then they can make those connections. So that's the goal. Is ultimately, you'll pick up a book like, oh man, what about Sandman? Like, it's the same thing. It's kind of that idea that some people could start making those connections, like connecting the dots themselves.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. So then I read it right then. So I get an A on my reading comprehension, which is really good. Happy about that, man. Yeah. So one of the things reading it that I thought was really interesting was the idea that I can't remember exactly who said it, and it was early-ish in the book, but one of the people you were talking to basically said, these events are a lot more common than we think they are. I can't remember if it was Purple or if it was someone else.
It was Purple.
It was Purple. Okay, so it reminded me actually of a story. So we on this show, we did a kind of a funny. I thought it would be funny if we did for Halloween, like last year or the year before or something, a thing about a haunted painting. Because one of my biggest and you actually talk about coincidences too, so this kind of ties into that too. But so I had, when I was a kid, my uncle Martin, my Aunt Maria, had in their Brooklyn home, they had this painting that was like oddly ominous for me. I don't know why I was so spooked by this painting, but I hated that painting. I thought it was so sinister. And it's like a pretty standard oil painting of like a river. You know what I mean? In the winter. And I just thought I got a bad vibe from that painting. I never wanted to sleep in that room, even though I always had to because it was like the guest room. You know, wasn't a fan of this painting at all. And my co-host Marie was like, "Oh, we should totally do a haunted painting. I'll go get one at a flea market and I'll paint it, right, myself." And so she goes to this flea market and she decides like she's like, "Oh, I found the perfect painting," and she sends me a photo of it. It's the same fucking painting. Like, I'm not kidding. It's the same painting. Okay? So we're freaking out. And Marie is like, "No, you're misremembering it. There's no way." And I'm like, "It's the same painting, Marie. I will never forget that painting." So I get my mom to go to Brooklyn, take a picture of the painting. It is the same painting, of course. So now we're freaking out, right? And then when the episode publishes, one of my cousins reaches out and says, "Hey, I saw a ghost in that room." And my uncle, evidently, I didn't know this, but evidently the guy that used to live in that apartment killed himself in that room. So it was like, that's like the closest to paranormal anything has ever gotten in my life. You know what I mean? And I'm reading your book and I'm like, that fucking painting, man. It's coincidences. It's media. It's all of it together. Has anything like that happened to you?
Nothing that creepy, because that's pretty creepy. It could be a simple coincidence, you know. None of them could be related to another. But like, you look at that and it's like, man, that's like 4 different coincidences.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's and even like you know, I am skeptical. You know what I mean? I am a skeptical person. But even that, like, to me, I was like, that's a little strange. It's a little weird.
I think that says something. If like you could spook out the most skeptical person, then there's something there. You know, there's yeah.
Oh yeah, even
a lot of the investigations for UFOs and in like Skinwalker Ranch, for example, a lot of those scientists who first started exploring this, they were skeptical to begin with, and they come out the other end with a different view on it. So I think it's always fascinating when presenting some of this material to skeptical people, that they kind of open up their minds a little bit to the possibilities.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny, right? Because it was in the, not the last chapter, but like the last kind of, I guess, analytical chapter before you got into kind of more of like personal like dreams and stuff like that, where Diana Pasulka is talking and mentions about the idea of coincidence and how it appears, and I thought it tied really nicely to the rest of the book, where if you're someone reading this book and you're kind of very skeptical, you're reading all this stuff about media and how it portrays these things, and you're kind of thinking like, well, maybe it's all coincidence, maybe it's all whatever. And then she gets in and is like, well, sometimes coincidences are freaking weird. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes coincidences themselves are a kind of a weird, like, I don't know, kismet or whatever, And so it's really interesting, I think, that idea of coincidence, but from the skeptical point of view, the thing I always wonder is, with those sorts of things, if it isn't looking for something or finding what you're looking for, right? So, you start working on something weird like this, and maybe you've had weird stuff happen your whole life, but you never thought of it as weird. Well, so it's one of two ways, right? You either didn't know it was weird, or you always thought it was common until you talk to somebody else, and then it's like, oh, that was paranormal and strange. Or the other way, now that you want it to be paranormal, you're looking back, right? And you're trying to find things that fit. It's always hard for me to separate that out for, I mean myself first off, but also I think for other people's stories. It's just such an interesting thing. So I wonder though, for yourself, where do you fall on the spectrum there of belief, I guess? Do you think, are you like 50-50? Do you think some of it is real, some of it is not? Do you think, are you all in? You know what I mean? Like, what do you think is, I guess, if you had to summarize in, what is 45 minutes minus 26 minutes, of time left on tape, right?
Uh,
If you had to summarize, I guess, what you think all of this is, and that's a hell of a ask. But if you had to give kind of like a thesis statement, what would you think it would be?
Man, that's so hard to kind of put into words, but
It's a terrible question
no, it's a
for an
good
interview,
question.
but
Challenging. But like, all right, so let me start with a couple of things. So like, I look at it this way: you make a really good point about people maybe willing themselves to believe because they want to believe that these things happen. So maybe they're more, acceptable to, believing that something happened and maybe it didn't. But there's also the people who've had these experiences who don't want to believe it happened because it was so terrifying and so traumatic for them. So you get like those two ends of the spectrum. And then like, you look at all these, stories about, these weird connections and these coincidences. And, at the same time, it's like that could exist, but are you really that special in the whole universe? So it's really hard to kind of definitively give you an answer on that because I think I kind of fall in the middle. It could be either one. But for me, to kind of answer your last question too. So I bring up a dream I had at the end of this book, and then also in my first book, I mentioned a dream I had too. And the very first book, when I was writing it, I was basically, researching every day this topic. I'll be watching documentaries, reading about it. So basically like I was doing UFO stuff all day for the most part. I'd stop to work out and eat and shower, So I had a nightmare one night, and it felt like I was being like abducted, or I was trying to be abducted. And what the conclusion I came to is, of course, that didn't happen. It was just all in my head because of how heavily into the research I was. Even though it felt like a night terror, like it felt real. But at the end of the day, I was like, I wouldn't. If it was a real abduction, I wouldn't have remembered as much as I did. So I kind of look at, people have those experiences too. But then I look at the dream I had when I was, so the dream I had that I referenced in this book, it wasn't when I was writing this book. This was before that. I think I did a post on my website about it. And it was so oddly specific, which kind of had me like shaking my head because I'm like, when you dream about stuff, you usually dream about things that are more abstract, I guess, or just larger things. And there's so much specific things that were in this dream that I remembered and were just kind of just stood out to me. And it's like it was just so oddly specific. Now I'm not saying that dream happened or not, but it's definitely a weird coincidence that it had all these specific, even like how the alien was like talking to me in this dream, really coincides with a lot of regression reports about how people apparently how they communicated as well. I thought that was a really weird thing to dream about because it was such a specific way the answer was worded, and just everything about that dream was just oddly specific. So I really want to include it in the book because I think it showed kind of that weird coincidence.
What's interesting about the dream section too is I think that we very rarely, and I think this is a shame, honestly, we very rarely get a glimpse into how other people cognate, how they dream, how they do kind of the physical, but also the mental process of thinking. The first time I ever considered that maybe there was something weird about the way that I thought was in a philosophy class, reading existential philosophy and reading about like Sartre and mostly Sartre. It was like an 80% of the class, but reading about Sartre and this notion in existential philosophy of the kind of dread of the what if. So you're sitting on a windowsill reading, and your mind thinks, well, I could jump out of this window at any time, and being terrified not only at the thought itself, but also terrified at the freedom of that expression, that you could do it, and what's stopping you, and why not do it, right? Other people in the class kind of thought of it differently than I did. And I was like, well, that's weird. I always thought people just had that fear like that, right? Turns out, no, that's obsessive compulsive disorder. Great. But, it was interesting, right? That sensation of like, oh, that's how other people think and it's different than I am. reading your dream chapter, it's funny actually. It reminds me, I've never had anything as kind of specific as what you had with an alien presence and that kind of thing. But I know, and I've spoken about this on the show a lot. I have extremely vivid dreams. I've always had extremely vivid dreams, and there are some, like you said, that are very flighty and like we're in a room and we're in the sky and we're in whatever. But then there are some that are kind of more solid. They're narrative, you know what I mean, and they fit into a larger narrative. There's a giant hotel I go to in my dreams all the time. You know what I mean? And it's common. It comes up all the time, right? And like rooms connect and they go a certain way, and it's so it's always interesting to me to hear about other people's dreams and their sensations of them. And I just thought it was a cool ass chapter, man. I just thought it was such a cool addition. And again, kind of regardless of, for me at least, it feels like the reality of the dream itself or not is sort of immaterial. You know what I mean? Because whether the dream is your brain talking to itself, or something talking to you, you can still gain perspective and I don't know, growth from a dream, I guess, And again, this is like the most woo I've ever gotten on an episode, frankly. That's how much I liked your book. But I think it's a really interesting concept, and it's something, again, that wasn't that far out. Right? For 95, 98% of human experience.
Yeah, and that's something you're talking about earlier, when you're in a philosophy class, and had you thinking a different way. And I remember, when I was in college taking, I think, philosophy, sociology, and you find out that these thoughts are kind of always there, but sometimes it takes reading and learning to kind of like bring it out, or your beliefs, or certain things that then justify your beliefs and kind of like the way you think as well. So I think that's a really cool thing about education is not only learning something new, but learning something new about yourself and how your mind works too, and which the values you hold. But yeah, like you're saying you're having this vivid dream. I'm going to suggest something to you to read. It's fictional. So Tom DeLonge and Susan Young, their Poet Anderson series. And it's really cool because it's basically, you said something, you said yours takes place in a hotel, and it's a reoccurring event. And in this book, there's something called Poets and Dreamwalkers. And the hotel is basically like a house for them in between the dream world and reality. So it's pretty interesting that you mentioned
Oh, that's weird. Yeah, man. That's cool.
Check out the books. The books are basically like Tom DeLonge came up with this idea after reading some studies about like dream studies. So they came up with this fictional thing. I mean, they're young adults, so they're written for kids. So there's some like young adult cliches, but like conceptually, it's pretty cool, and it's like as like franchise material. And I think you would really like it, especially with the whole dream and hotel thing too. So it's always fascinating. Like, see, right there, we made a connection from something fictional.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting, right? For me, it has always gone back to that kind of famous memory trick of the memory palace, right? Or the memory walk, where you put your mental states or your mental memories into your brain is good at geolocating. So your brain is good at knowing, like, I take 10 steps, I'm at the door. I take 20 steps, I'm in the hallway, right? It's so interesting, man. So one thing, I guess, or one final thing is a question a question I had for you generally was, with that whole idea of not knowing how people cognate or not seeing how other people think, it seems to me, at least, that that's one area where both skeptics and true believers fall short in their analysis, which is thinking or assuming that everyone thinks the same way they do. I'll never forget, in college, I had a friend who, we found out one night at the bar that he physically could not hear music. It didn't make sense to him. It was like, how did he described it, like, I'm trying to think, almost like Charlie Brown's teacher, how she kind of talks, but it's not words. That it was like that. Like, so he like clinically tone deaf, you know? That is so out of the realm of possibility for most people to think about. You know? You'd never consider that that's a thing. But it is true. That is a thing that occurs and exists. I wonder if books like yours or similar books in like philosophy, in even just narratively, right? Of introducing someone to the way someone else thinks, or kind of leading them through that thought process in an interesting way. That I thought was actually, in my mind at least, the most effective part of the book was that description of that process. And also just kind of reading it, it felt like the whole book was a little bit of your thought process, right? It felt very, not stream of consciousness per se, because that's just like James Joyce unreadability, right? But it felt very much so like an internal dialogue, I guess. And so I just thought really at the end, for the most part, I think it was, that to me was the most effective, or the most interesting, I thought.
Interesting. That's an interesting take on that. And the stream of consciousness then kind of makes sense. I mean, I was selective of what I chose to feature in there, but like, I mean, a lot of these thoughts are obviously my own and my own interests. It's, my book. But like the idea of just challenging people's thoughts in the first place is something I try to do in the first two books too. So I really wanted to challenge people's way of thinking to do it just to kind of tie it all together with this book. But you made a good point earlier, is that how we tend to disregard how other people think and how their mind works. And a lot of times, sometimes we'll find fault at other people, and it's like, everyone's wired differently, so it's really hard to, I guess it's sometimes hard to kind of come to that conclusion that, I'm right and you're wrong, but our brains are just wired differently, so especially with this topic too, we're wired to think so differently. But it's like, one of the things I did in the book is I wanted to show, how things are perceived through different cultures and folklores and mythology as well. So people can say, well, they may be witnessing the same or having the same experience, but they're thinking about it differently. They're digesting it differently. And that's basically kind of the point you made earlier. We all think differently as well. So, you can still challenge people's belief systems, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's up to that person to kind of choose the path they want to go down. Do you want to continue thinking the way they do, or do they want to maybe, open their mind up a little bit? Or, but in some cases, people just can't, like you said, the example you gave about your friend who just couldn't hear music the way everyone else does. And, that's awful. Like, I feel awful for that. But no, I mean, like, who's to judge? Oh, well, you can't do this, or there's something wrong with you, or whatever. Everyone's wired different. I think we have to try to respect that, as long as people are still morally doing the right thing.
For sure, man. And that's actually, I guess, kind of the last part of this that I guess we can get into, or maybe we should get into, is one of the big questions for me with all of this whole field is the ethics, I guess, around or surrounding the questions of belief, right? So it feels very much so like, subjectively, if you want to believe something, that seems fine, right? There's nothing ethically questionable there at all. Where it becomes questionable, I guess one of the concerns that I always have with these fields is the sense of dogmatism and telling someone this is the way it is, or even doing some doing some things that aren't necessarily all that ethical, like hypnosis, or like I don't know, fake cures for things or whatever. One of the interesting things in the book, I guess, or I think the book is written and put in a way that you kind of don't, it doesn't ever ask those ethical questions. I think that's by design, I would imagine.
Yeah.
From your perspective, though, or I guess, and I think it's just a question that I've started asking everyone who comes on the show that does this kind of stuff, really, is from your perspective, like, in terms of the ethics of belief or the ethics of this stuff, if none of this is real, if none of it at the root is real, are the people saying it's real ethically culpable?
So you have to assume that they knew from the start it wasn't real.
Well, so that right. Well, so that I think is the interesting or the best answer to that question, I guess. Right? Is like you said.
Yeah, I mean, look at it this way: like, you could study for something for a long time, and then at the end of the day, you could be wrong about it. That doesn't mean that your intentions were unethical or wrong. But like, if you look at it like as a journalist perspective, right? If you ethically approach something, you do the reporting on it, right, the ethical way, and at the end of the day, maybe the story isn't what it was supposed to be, or maybe it's not the biggest story as you thought. That doesn't necessarily mean ethically, you were wrong. I mean, if you did the right things as a journalist, you should be okay. That's one of the things, that I teach as a journalism teacher, and I learned in journalism too, is, you need to cover your tracks, right? But with what we're doing, what we're interested in, it's so hard because it's like, if all of this stuff wasn't real, if we found out it was all like just something that happened in our brain or whatever, I don't think anyone would be held responsible because no one knows really. You can't fault the person for trying to find the answers and then not finding it, because so many of these questions that we want answer to, we may never get the answers, or we may not never know them. So, it's really hard, especially because like there's people who've been dedicated like their lives to this. Like some of these people have been doing this for like, 20 years. Like it blows my mind, because we were talking, before we went on the air about kind of like ufology, and it's like, how do you not get burned out with this stuff? Because I mean, you know how it is, when you were with MUFON and how crazy that situation was, and just how UFO Twitter is. And it's like, I was telling people earlier, I was like, if this is the last book I ever write about UFOs, I'd be happy with it, because I'm really proud of the job I did on it. But at the same time, like, this stuff is exhausting. Like it really gets tedious.
It does. It's hard. It's so hard, man. It's like the worst hobby I've ever had. I mean, I don't know. Between this, I've heard that like competitive Magic the Gathering is almost as taxing on the soul. It's just for me at least, it is such a fascinating thought experiment to think, like you said, if imagine a scenario where everybody thinks they're telling the truth. Everyone is good faith looking for answers. And I think that's mostly true for everyone. I think that's probably like 99% of the people in this field, right? They're all good faith looking for answers, but it all stems from like one lie. You know what I mean? It's so interesting to me, that part of it. Like what it's just, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like the economy is like that, frankly. It's all based on the one lie that like, this is valuable, and then everyone starts trading crap around it. But anyways, man, no, it is hard for people who are, though, because frankly, I'm going to give this book to my nephews and nieces for sure, because I think they're going to be super interested in it, and I think it's a great book to give kids who are into this stuff. Because it's also kind of like, you sneak in like a good bit of like, again, like philosophy of mind and like sociology and anthropology. It's like, it's a good way to kind of be like, they're learning, but like not really learning, which I thought was also really, really well done on your part. For someone who does want to get interested or does want to get involved in this, who does want to learn more, where do you suggest they go? What do you suggest they do?
Man, that's such a tough question, because like there's so many like good books or cases that are like kind of like starters for it. Years ago, Jason McClellan wrote a book, Only Weirdos See UFOs. It basically just sums up like the whole history of like, like gives you brief little descriptions of like all the big cases, the books to read. I think it's a really awesome guide. But like, obviously tell people, go to Roswell and, read about that and read about Area 51 and all those, all those cases. But like, it's hard to really pinpoint, because I think that has to come for the individual. What do they decide? For me, the first real UFO book I really was gravitated to was Communion. I just remember seeing the cover, and there's something about that cover, the art, that creepy looking alien, and even the name Communion. It was like, it's such a, I don't know, just something about just everything about it. I was drawn to it, and there's something I mentioned in that book too about it. It's like a book connection.
Yeah, no, you do. Yeah, yep.
For certain reasons, which is a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down it. But yeah, so it's like, I think that depends on the person, because I think this is a book where, you can learn a lot from it just by questioning yourself and your own beliefs. I don't want to write a book where I'm lecturing someone or saying this is this and there's a quiz on it next week. It's more of, hey, these things have occurred potentially, and there's also commonalities between that and the movies you watch and the comic books you read. So let's come to the realization that these occurrences aren't really all that odd, and then let's go from there. So yeah, I think that's like all in the eye of the beholder. If they were picking up my book or another book or whatever, it's really hard to tell them, where to start. Like I said, for me, it was communion. There's just something about that book I was drawn to for whatever reason. And it resonated with me when I read it too. I didn't just pick it up because I thought it looked cool. And then I was like, yeah, but that book was, that was the one for me. And I think it all depends on the reader. Who knows, they may pick up a book they may go backwards. Maybe they'll pick up a book about Bigfoot and then, start, get into UFOs. And I kind of meant, it kind of brings me back to the idea of music. When you start discovering bands and artists, maybe you start with one genre and like they always say, like in punk rock, most kids in the 90s, like me, got started with pop punk. And then like you kind of work your way backwards. You go to the predecessors, the old school punk, and then you start listening to emo music and then like post-hardcore. So it's like this kind of like evolution musically, and it's kind of like the same thing with these subjects too. I think a lot of people get into the nuts and bolts of ufology first, and then I think the trend nowadays, people are kind of getting away from that. These new age ideas are suddenly more acceptable, where 10 or 20 years ago they wouldn't have been.
Yeah, no, for sure, man. The cyclical nature of the field, and just kind of all fields, it seems like it's really interesting. It's kind of a commonality or a thing that appears in a lot of thought, which is kind of cool. The one thing, so the last question I ask you, right, because it's late, I'm sure you're tired. If tomorrow a UFO lands in front of the White House, maybe not the White House, a UFO lands in front of the EU Parliament building,
There you go.
and a being comes out and is like, "Give me an hour, I'm gonna explain it all," right? And so this being, let's say he's a little gray. Let's call him a gray, right? He comes out and he gives the whole history, right? Do you think that the mythologizing or the stories would collapse around what is now apparently the true theme? Or do you think the mythologizing would continue?
It's a great question. I mean, look at how society, especially our country, views not these themes, but just views truth in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're so just such everything that's happened in our country, with the past 4 years. I mean, honestly, you have a large part of our population who doesn't believe in science, they don't listen to scientists, they don't listen to the news, they listen to who it's selective hearing. And it's like, I feel like if a UFO came down or a gray came down, a bunch of people would be like, that's bullshit. I don't believe him. If it was Jesus who came down, I would believe him. Or, what if that alien came down and said he was Jesus? A fraction of people wouldn't believe him anyway. So, and once again, this goes back to my first book, this idea of our process of belief, what we choose to believe and what we don't. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I think the cultural impact of like a UFO coming down, an alien coming down, would be huge. But I guarantee there'd be a large portion of this population that would be like, no. And that kind of always reminds me of this brilliant lyric in a Bad Religion song. And it goes, I'll believe in God when 1 and 1 are 5. And I think that's pretty interesting. But it's like all these things could, you could believe in, God, and you can believe in science. They don't have to be like adversarial. But yeah, I just think, the way our society thinks nowadays, we could have the truth in front of us and a bunch of people will just reject it. And I'm connecting that to current events, what's happening right now. I mean, like you said, the CDC will say wear masks, and you see a bunch of people saying, "Oh, I don't need to wear masks," and
ain't nobody gonna listen to those damn nerds, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's infuriating. It really is. It's like, when did the idea of basic science? I mean, this isn't anything too complex. When did this idea of intellectualism and basic science get diluted and vilified. So it's like, yeah, it's frustrating.
It is frustrating. It is one of those things that I think it's a common what's the word? I really do think, and I kind of wonder this too. It's one of those things that I think has been rolled up into the idea of, and I think part of the downfall of metaphysics was the idea that metaphysics seems by its nature to be like sleight of hand. You know, it seems like card tricks. It seems like you're fooling somebody, or it's, you know, because it's based on belief, it can't be true in any feasible or good way or interesting way. And I wonder, you know, part of that seems to be part of that. I think people generally are rejecting that feeling in the United States right now. That metaphysics, that belief that all these other parts of human emotion aren't as valid as, say, science or scientism. But at the same time, there are some things that feelings it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? There's some things that there are some kind of like bare hard facts that seem just pragmatically to be the case. And just as the same way, there are some cold, or maybe not cold hard, but maybe there are some warm, spongy things that science can't touch, right? I don't know, man. I think, but Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. It was so much fun. Where can people find you? Punk Rock and UFOs, obviously.
punkrockandufos.com. The book is Stranger Than Fiction. It's on Amazon, Kindle, and Barnes & Noble. Please get it. I think it's my life's best work I've ever done in terms of this subject. And Chris, once again, thank you again for having me on. I always like having our discussions because not only are they fascinating and thought-provoking, I think your approach is different than any of the other podcasts out there. Just kind of where you're coming from. You're coming at almost like from like not like left field, but like a different angle, which is really cool. I think, you know, as an interviewer, I think it gives the interviewee a lot to kind of digest. Like, you know, these are all really good thought-provoking questions. So thank you again for having me.
Thanks, man. We try. You know what? We try not to ask the same old questions. If I asked you what your favorite UFO case was every time, you wouldn't come on the show, right? So, man, yeah, you'd still come on. I know. You're a friend of the show, so you got it. You can't say no. I'd stop talking to you, right? No, man. Thank you so much, listeners. Please do buy the book, Stranger Than Fiction. Even if you're listening to this and you're a skeptic, you're someone who, you know, doesn't think there's anything in any of this UFO stuff. It is a fascinating read. Well worth the time. I honestly, not even kidding, could not put it down. Thought it was really great. Loved it. Absolutely. Everyone, again, this has been Mike Damante and Stranger Than Fiction, Punk Rock and UFOs. Check them out. Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at Mad Scientist Pod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Yes, we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal.